The way you treat the text ought to be the way you treat a significant other in your lives. And just as in a relationship, it is unethical to go imposing your entire self on the other person such that they have no room in the relationship. You shouldn't be treating a text that way either, certainly not a sacred text. And so, yes, we have to bring our full selves to the encounter with the Talmud, with all of our beliefs and our biases and our opinions, but we equally have to allow the Talmud to bring its opinions and beliefs and biases to the encounter with us.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. There was a time not long ago when Aggadah, which broadly speaking refers to the non-legal passages in the Talmud, was largely ignored. Students studying in yeshiva would run through these texts quickly, if at all, using almost all of their mental energy and time thinking through the halachic, or legal passages of the Gemara. While that was likely a successful methodology for most Talmud students in the past, we have witnessed in the 20th and 21st centuries a renewed emphasis on Aggadah. And given the fact that Talmud study is far more widespread today than it was in the past, along with an obvious thirst for greater spirituality and a deeper connection with God, this can only be considered a very positive development. At the forefront of the study of Aggadah today is my guest, Gila Fine, and she offers a fascinating, compelling, and perhaps controversial view of how we should look at Aggadah. We discuss how Aggadah is a path to knowledge of God, the way that it gives space for outsiders and people who feel burned by Jewish law, the manner in which it is radical and subversive and offers a chance for rabbinic self-critique, how Aggadah is multivocal, allowing in different ideas and positions rather than one consistent voice, and not necessarily trying to resolve that inherent tension, the way that someone learning Talmud should develop an honest relationship with the text, the difference between the way that God is presented in the Bible versus a much lonelier portrayal in the Aggadah, whether Aggadah should be regarded as fiction, and if so, whether that undermines its authority, and much more. Gila said that we may be the first Jews since the days of Chazal who can truly relate to the radical spirit of the Aggadah. In her words, the rabbis were extremely radical, and then, as generally happens, they lose that radical edge. Those subversive elements disappear. Postmodernism has allowed us to reconnect to a certain radical property of rabbinic storytelling that has gone underappreciated for most of Jewish history. For me, one of the most important ideas that Gila suggested was her insight that Aggadic passages don't try to speak in a single voice. Instead, multiple views, sometimes even contradicting the normative and accepted viewpoint, are presented as valid. When it comes to halakha, we need to have a final decision. But that should not mean that the opinions that are not accepted as part of the normative law go away. They remain part and parcel of Judaism's symphony of Torah. And that even includes voices that feel hurt by the halachic determination. Bringing these into the conversation, even though they don't have normative implications, does not undermine Torah. In fact, it makes Torah that much greater and more inclusive of all of us. And what I believe is an echo of Rav Soloveitchik's ideas in the halachic mind, Rabbi Sachs wrote in his book, The Dignity of Difference, that while in heaven there is truth, on earth there are truths. That does not mean that truth is relative. It means instead that fallible human beings, almost by definition, can only offer one perspective on truth, which is greater than one mind or one culture can contain. I believe that the same is true for Torah. And when we indulge a common desire to make Torah more narrow than it is, incorrectly contending that there is only one strand of the tradition, and that ultimately the disagreements in the Talmud are essentially minor, and that everyone is basically in agreement about the big questions, we are making Torah smaller than it should be. There are many people today who refuse to acknowledge that Torah has many voices, and that these voices sometimes disagree about big issues too. Ignoring these voices is, I think, an affront to Torah, and I was pleased to discuss that issue in my interview with Gila. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, We will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Gila Fine is a lecturer of rabbinic literature at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, exploring the tales of the Talmud through philosophy, literary criticism, psychoanalysis, and pop culture. She is the recipient of the Maimonides Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and serves on the faculties of the Nachshon Project, Amudim Seminary, the Tikva Scholars Program, and the London School of Jewish Studies, in addition to teaching thousands of students at conferences, campuses, and communities across the Jewish world. Haaretz has called her a young woman on her way to becoming one of the more outstanding Jewish thinkers of the next generation. Gila's new book is The Mad Woman in the Rabbi's Attic, Rereading the Women of the Talmud, which was the recipient, announced just last week, of the 2024 Rabbi Sacks Book Prize. Gila Fine, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about the importance and place of Aggadah in Judaism today, what it is and what it should be and what it can be. We can't begin, however, Gila, without defining our terms. So what then is your definition of Aggadah?
Well, my definition aside, the definition, or maybe the literal definition of Aggadah is simply a story. Aggadah is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew Haggadah, which means a tale, that which we tell, which is very simple. It also isn't very good as a definition. To take one simple example, very early on in the Talmud, we have a statement by Rav Chia that God puts on tefillin. Now, that is generally considered to be Aggadah, although it's not really a story in the traditional sense of having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so we have to kind of look further afield to try and come up with a good definition of Aggadah. The rabbis themselves attempt to, on more than one occasion. In the Midrash, they say, quote, "Do you wish to know the creator of the world? Then learn Aggadah, for through it you will come to know God and cleave to his ways." Which implies that Aggadah is about the big questions. It's about God and morality and religion. In the Talmud, the rabbis say Aggadah, they define Aggadah as, quote, words which draw one's heart like a narrative. Because the rabbis recognize centuries before psychoanalysis that stories are really compelling because they have a way of bypassing our reason and going directly to the heart. And in the Psikta de Rav Kahana, and this is probably my favorite, the revelation, God's revelation at Sinai is described as having multiple faces. And again, to quote, it says, an angry face for Bible, a moderate face for Mishnah, a friendly face for Talmud, and a laughing face for Aggadah. So Aggadah is the laughing face of God, which implies that it is somehow playful or whimsical or subversive even. So these are all these rabbinic attempts to define Aggadah are very beautiful and very poetic, but they don't really work as a scientific working definition. The scientific working definition that we have and that is used by scholars to this day comes to us in the Gaonic period, which is the period directly following the rabbinic period, where Rav Shmuel Chofni Gaon says Aggadah essentially is not halacha. Very simply put, rabbinic literature at large can be divided into two meta-genres. We've got halacha, which are the legal conversations, and then we have Aggadah, which is basically everything else. So under this very broad negative definition, we have a whole slew of Aggadic subgenres. We have Midrash, which are the stories the rabbis tell about the Bible. We have rabbinic legend, or Ma'aseh Chachamim, which are the stories the rabbis tell about themselves. We have philosophical inquiry and epigraphs. We have parables and sermons and folk tales and jokes. And it's not just a multiplicity of form that defines Aggadah, it is also very much a multiplicity of content. Aggadah really spans the gamut from these lofty conversations of metaphysics and theology and ethics to very small everyday stories of food and money and illness and friendship and study and sex. And one of the things I love most about Aggadah, and there are many things I love about Aggadah, but one of the things I love most is that in Aggadah, nothing is deemed too small or too trivial to be included. In Aggadah, everything is included because everything is meaningful. Everything is significant. Everything carries a lesson to be learned.
That's fascinating. I have to ask about that negative definition, which is the way that I've always learned it as well. It's everything that's not halachic falls into that broad category of Aggadah. Part of that issue that you mentioned now, it includes everything from midrash and deep conversations about theology to jokes and medicine and demonology and things that we might not want to take necessarily, quote unquote, as seriously. With halakha, there is a way for us to determine what the normative action is. At the end, there's usually a conclusion either in the Talmud itself or frequently in the Rishonim and Achronim who decide how we're actually going to act. That helps us understand and filter, not that it doesn't matter what the other opinions say, but practically in our lives, we know what to do. When it comes to Aggadah, we don't have that. We have no way of knowing which one should be taken more seriously, which one is a joke. There may be something that Chazal said that was not meant so seriously. It was a joke, and we don't understand that. We take it very seriously. Is there a way for us to figure out what in Aggadah should be taken with greater weight and what perhaps with a bit less weight than the others?
That's a fantastic question. I would say that anything that actually made it in, anything that was canonized as part of the Talmud or indeed any rabbinic work should be taken seriously. But taking a legend seriously is quite different than taking a midrash seriously, and that in turn is different than taking a joke seriously. These are all serious matters in that they all have something to teach us. That's why I said everything carries a lesson to be learned. But you have to be able to properly identify the genre if you're going to read and try and extrapolate what it is that the rabbis wished for you to learn. In fact, one of the main mistakes that we make when we look at Aggadah, and the reason that it's been traditionally marginalized in Jewish history, is that we read these stories very often as history, whereas the rabbis never intended for these stories to be read as historical.
That's very interesting. Let me ask about the book Halachic Man by Rav Soloveitchik. That was a book which had a tremendous impact upon me the first time I read it in my early 20s. And while today there are other books which I can say have a greater impact upon my thinking about Judaism, nevertheless, reading that book was a very important moment for me in my life and in my development as a religious Jew. I still remember in 1995 sitting in the Sukkah and reading that. It was essentially a seminal moment for me. Now, he doesn't denigrate Aggadah there at all, but it's very much concentrated on learning halacha, creating halacha, understanding what Chazal are doing and being able to make it your own is the essential centerpiece of Judaism. And in some ways, Gila, I think that might represent a very common idea in terms of the marginalization of the Aggadah, of the non-legal portions of the Torah. Even though he doesn't say we should marginalize it, but implicitly, the halacha is the real serious stuff. It's almost implied there. Using that as a jumping off point, can you tell me about ways in which Aggadah was traditionally marginalized and why?
So first, I really have to say I absolutely share your admiration of Halachic Man. That work too had a very profound impact on me when I went through my own religious journey as a young adult. It's important, I think, to recognize that in the rabbinic period, the rabbis themselves really give Aggadah a place of pride within their writings. In the Talmud, which kind of comprises both Halakha and Aggadah, Aggadah is roughly said to comprise 1/3 of the text. So it is very, very central. As we exit the rabbinic period, and throughout Jewish history, as you say, Aggadah was traditionally marginalized and sometimes ignored entirely. And I think there are several reasons for this. For one thing, and you kind of touch upon this, halakha has immediate practical significance. We learn halakha because we need to know what it is that we need to do. Whereas Aggadah has no concrete use in that way. It's harder to understand what it is that Aggadah is pointing us to do if it is instructing us to do anything at all. Moreover, these stories, as I mentioned, will often seem trivial or silly or inconsequential. There's another problem with Aggadah as we exit the rabbinic period, and that is the worldwide move from antiquity to the Middle Ages is often characterized by historians as the move from mythos to logos. So Greek philosophy takes over the world, and we are now highly rational creatures. And we no longer believe in the supernatural and the mythic in the way that the ancients did. And so the stories of rabbinic literature, which will often feature miracles or men with magical powers or mythic creatures, these stories that posed no difficulty for the original audience in the rabbinic period are now kind of problematic and kind of uncomfortable. But perhaps even more uncomfortable, and one of the main reasons, I think, for the marginalization of Aggadah goes back to this definition of Aggadah as the laughing face of God. Aggadah is playful in the sense that this is where the rabbis let themselves play. So they don't have to dictate a definite course of action in Aggadah, and they are also not as bound by earlier traditions. Both the laws and the narratives are transmitted in the rabbinic period orally for many generations until they assume their final form in the Talmud and in other rabbinic works. But whereas in halakha, the rabbis are very careful to preserve the tradition as they receive it, and they only revise it very lightly. In Aggadah, they revise and edit and rework quite freely. And so Aggadah is liberated. It is free of the constraints of halakha, which is why the rabbis really allow themselves to be far more radical, far more subversive, and far more self-critical in the stories. We have many stories in the Talmud of rabbis behaving badly. Now, as long as these stories were created by rabbis for rabbis. For most of Jewish history, the rabbis were a small intellectual elite, and the study of these stories was confined to the rabbinic ivory tower of the Beit Midrash. But as we get to the end of rabbinic history, and certainly as we move past rabbinic history into the Gaonic period and further down Jewish history, the rabbis are now the uncontested leaders of the Jewish world, and the Talmud becomes canon. So these stories are not only taught by rabbis to other rabbis, they are now far more widely read. And what do you do with stories of rabbis behaving badly when they are now available for more public consumption? That is a matter of deep discomfort. And so the study of Aggadah, as we move further and further down Jewish history, presents a real cultural challenge. And there are various strategies to dealing with this challenge. Perhaps the original one, and again, we already mentioned the Gaonic period, officially distinguishes halakha from Aggadah, and then it invalidates the latter. One basic Gaonic principle is we do not rely on Aggadah. Halakha is authoritative and it is binding, and Aggadah is simply not. Another strategy is to read these stories allegorically. Maimonides will say as a riddle or a parable. So, for instance, if I mention stories of rabbis behaving badly, there's a very disturbing story in Tractate Shabbat about Rav who travels to Babylon on a ship, meets Shmuel, the man who will end up becoming his lifelong chavuta, but then Shmuel subjects him to a very cruel and humiliating hazing, essentially. He induces him with diarrhea and refuses to show him the toilet. It's an awful story. Now, the traditional commentator, the Maharal, will basically say, I believe it's the Maharal, no, it's not actually a story of Rav traveling on a ship. You have to read it as an allegory of the soul that is traveling in the body. And he kind of creates this whole rather fanciful parable of the story, which, with all due respect to Maharal, I think is simply an incorrect way of reading it. Because when the rabbis want to give us a parable, they're not shy about giving us a parable. They generally tell us there's a clue. They say a parable to what may this be compared. They don't try and hide the fact that it's a parable. But the rabbis don't always give us parables. They give us, as I said, sermons and folk tales and legends. And it is a categorical error to read all of these stories as if they are all parables. Another strategy which we see very often amongst the medieval Talmudists is to sort of remove the subversive sting of these stories by providing them with apologetic explanations. So again, going back to the hazing of Rav by Shmuel, Rashi will say, no, it's not a hazing. Actually, Shmuel is a doctor and Rav was sick, and inducing him with diarrhea was a way of curing him. Which again, with the tremendous respect that we all have for Rashi, I think is not taking the rabbinic storyteller seriously here. It's explaining away a story that is actually far more complex. But really the main strategy, which you discussed is just marginalizing these stories, if not ignoring them entirely. For most of Jewish history, these stories were disregarded. They were glossed over in traditional yeshiva study, and they were ignored by the majority of commentators. If you see a page of Talmud and the page is mostly taken up by a story, you'll find that the commentaries in the margins are very sparse because the commentators were simply just not interested in the stories. And to this day, if you walk into an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, you'll find that students will plow their way through a halachic discussion. They'll reach a story and they will speed read through it, or they'll simply skip over it entirely and begin the next halachic discussion.
So Gila, in that case, if the Rashi method in the story you presented as an example in Masechet Shabbat with Rav and Shmuel, if the Rashi apologetics is not really what's going on, and the Maharalian type of make it into a parable is not really what's going on, then why did they include it at all? What's the point? What were Chazal thinking? And obviously this is by definition speculative. But if it's not supposed to be a parable, and if it's not teaching us a particular thing, what exactly were Chazal doing by including this in Shas?
So again, I go back to the definition of Aggadah, are words which draw one's heart like a parable, and the definition of, if you wish to know the creator of the world, learn Aggadah. These stories are educational. They are there to impart certain moral or religious teachings. The rabbis use the literary devices and the rhetorical ploys of narrative in order to impart their particular teachings.
In that case, in a situation like that one, I don't necessarily know if you can give me the shot, what they're trying to teach, but what would the moral of the story be? What are they trying to instruct us by saying that Shmuel was being cruel to Rav? Are they saying Shmuel was wrong, or are they approving of cruelty in certain situations? When you have stories, part of the power of a story is that the lesson isn't necessarily clear. When the lesson is explicit, it's usually not such a deep story. To understand a deep story, it's somewhat ambiguous. So what kind of methodology of teaching were they doing here?
So you mentioned pshat, and I submit that these stories are very rarely pshat. In fact, one of the hallmarks of rabbinic storytelling is what I call in my book the false front. What these stories seem to be saying and what they are actually saying are often diametrically opposite to one another. We have to sort of break through the apparent meaning and go to the actual meaning, and that requires some very sophisticated, very nuanced literary analysis. I'm not sure I can go too deeply into the story of Rav Shmuel. That would take me about an hour and a very elaborate source sheet, which I do not have on hand. But there is some very deep symbolism in this story. It has to do with the rabbinic gut, because Rav has he does have some sort of gut illness. And you have to understand the symbolism, the literary symbolism that is invoked by the rabbinic storyteller in telling us a story about a Rav going from Israel to Babylon, carrying something within his body that then has to be purged from his body. It has to do with the tensions between the rabbinic communities in Israel and Babylon. They're vying for leadership over the Jewish world. It has to do with the experience of immigration, which is a pervasive experience in rabbinic literature. It has to do with the experience that you must undergo when you try and establish yourself in a new place. But without going too deeply into it, no, I don't think the rabbis in telling the story are condoning cruelty. In fact, Shmuel at the end of the story loses his sons as a punishment. So the rabbis are giving some sort of very difficult lesson about what an immigrant must undergo, and yet what the natives must not be doing to the immigrants.
I want to ask about what you said a few moments ago, that the rabbis initially intended for Aggadic material to really remain in-house. These were rabbis talking to other rabbis, scholars talking to scholars. They never really intended for, quote unquote, the rest of us to be seeing this. I think of Professor Leo Strauss, who wrote extensively on the Rambam, and he believed, perhaps controversially, that the Rambam wanted the Moreh Nevuchim to remain esoteric. So he himself, in writing about it, writes in a very esoteric way, so you can't even understand what he's saying, because he says if that's what he wanted, we can't simply reveal his secrets. I want to apply that, or ask about applying it, to Aggadah. If the rabbis weren't really talking to me, then what right do I have to read this material? It wasn't intended for me. Maybe it's a type of voyeurism because I'm not equipped to handle the material that they were really just saying to their colleagues.
That is a fantastic question, and I've never actually thought about that. I would say that, as opposed to Maimonides, the rabbis, I'm not sure there's any real evidence to suggest that the rabbis want to keep their texts private, as much as they simply had no notion that one day their texts would be studied as widely as they are today. I think that is a key difference. The way you state the question kind of puts me in mind of Kafka, who famously wanted his writings to be burnt, and Bott refuses to do so, as a result of which we all read Kafka today, and I, for one, have no moral compunction in reading Kafka.
And Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is quite similar in some ways.
Exactly. I very much do believe, as a new critic, I do believe to an extent in the death of the author. Once you've created something and you put it out into the world, it is no longer yours. It is the province of every single person who cares to busy themselves with it and inquire into it. And I'd like to say, having spent many, many years trying to get into the heads of the rabbis, I think they would be thrilled.
Okay, I like that answer. Thank you, Gila. Before we go further into talking about the modern place of Aggadah and what it can offer that studying Gemara without it does not offer and what we can gain out of it, I want to ask you about what you just said in terms of the death of the author and our ability to study it as we want. Can you explain what that means? Meaning, I mean something very specific. Are we talking about the fact that we have the right to interpret it and decide what the author originally meant? Or do we have the right to read our own ideas into it, to use it as the basic building blocks to create a new hashkafa, which may not have been the original intent? It's not just that when we talk about the death of the author, we mean the author has no right to tell me what the intent is. It's that I don't care what his intent was. Rav Shagar talks about this a bit when he talks about the broken vessels and rebuilding them into something new. I'm wondering how you understand Aggadah. Is the goal of our study of Aggadah to know what the original intent of the author is, even if we don't really have any way of knowing it? Or is it to build from those kelim shvurim, these initial ideas that are on the page, to build something which is meaningful to us, even if it is somewhat different from the original intent?
You're very good at asking me questions that I feel like I cannot answer within the confines of this podcast and without my source sheets. I actually have a whole class on this because the rabbis themselves were very preoccupied by this question, the question of death of the author. In a way, they asked that question about God, the ultimate author. What can we do with the text that God has given us? How far can we go in interpreting it?
In perhaps most famous Aggadah in all of Shas, in Bava Metzia Nuntet, about Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer lo b'shamayim. That is that exact question.
That text is the focus of the final chapter of my book, and I have a great deal to say about it, which I shan't. But yes, the Avon of Achnai is perhaps the classic proof text of death of the author in the Talmud. How do we resolve the tension between the divine author with a capital A and the human reader? And I will say that I am very much a fascist when it comes to this question. One of my goals in teaching these stories, and probably every class and every course I've ever taught, begins with these stories are not a free-for-all. They are not a free-for-all, and you ought not go imposing your own sensibilities, your own agendas, your own thoughts and feelings on these stories. I think that is an ethical error, and I think it's ethical. In other words, I say in the book, reading is a relationship. The way you treat the text ought to be the way you treat a significant other in your lives. And just as in a relationship, it is unethical to go imposing your entire self on the other person such that they have no room in the relationship. You shouldn't be treating a text that way either, certainly not a sacred text. And so, yes, we have to bring our full selves to the encounter with the Talmud, with all of our beliefs and our biases and our opinions, but we equally have to allow the Talmud to bring its opinions and beliefs and biases to the encounter with us. And one of the main objectives in the book, and I say this very early on in the introduction, I basically show how to read these stories without falling into these pitfalls of reading yourself into the text. It's true that the author is dead in that they're no longer around to tell us, to whisper in our ears exactly what they meant. But Michel Foucault, who writes extensively about the death of the author, says, yes, the author is dead, but in the process of the death, which is the process of creation, the process of writing, the author will plant in the text traces of his or her own intent, such that by the time we, the reader, receive the text, the author may be long gone, but we can always recreate the author from inside the text. We may not know the author, but we know what the author intended because the author left us clues both in the building blocks of the text itself and in the context. And what I do in the book is I show exactly how to identify the building blocks of the text and the different layers of context in a way that allows us to come up with an interpretation that at least aims to approximate the original meaning of the story as it might have been intended by the rabbis.
Okay, thank you for that. Very interesting. Just on the side, this reminds me what you're saying right now. A different book by Rav Soloveitchik. My favorite Rav Soloveitchik book is The Halachic Mind, M-I-N-D, not Halachic Man, where he talks about reconstructing Jewish thought out of the sources of halacha. People often misunderstand that, I think. They think he means only halachic sources, but he's actually explicit. He means the whole mass of Jewish text, whether it's halacha, Aggadah. We have all of these must be put together in order to reconstruct what that initial idea is. And he says, in some ways, the difference between liberal Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, in his view, is the direction they go. Are you imposing on the text, or are you deriving from the text? So what you're saying reminds me very much of the halachic mind, which I say again is another very, very important text in my own life. I want to move forward into some other questions about the importance of Aggadah. We've almost been talking around it. It's the way that we see the laughing face of God. But what does it provide in a way that halacha cannot? What is the importance of studying Aggadah such that I won't get that out of learning Baba Metzia, the halachic sugyot that are there?
We ended our historical overview really with early modernity, where Aggadah is still marginalized. And I think it's important to kind of fill in the gap and speak about how we got to where we got today, where Aggadah is not only no longer marginalized, but actually is some of the most popular subject matter to be studying in Jewish studies today. And so Aggadah really kind of moves to the forefront in the modern era, not in the yeshiva, but actually in the secular academies. It's brought back into focus by Jewish historians who go to Aggadah as a window into rabbinic history, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, because the rabbinic period is the classical period of Judaism. It's supremely important. And the only historical evidence that we have of this period are the writings of the rabbis themselves. So these are historical records which, just to make things problematic, are not really historical. The rabbis never, again, it's categorical error to read these stories as history. The rabbis never intended for these stories to be read as history. They did not seek to chronicle history. These are very candidly pieces of rabbinic fiction. And we can tell because, well, for one thing, there are glaring contradictions between how the rabbis describe key characters and key events of antiquity and what we know of the same characters and events from Roman or Persian history. So, for instance, in the tractate Gittin, there's a famous story of the destruction of Jerusalem. And in that story, we are told that Nero is sent to destroy Jerusalem, but he has second thoughts because he's in fact a God-fearing man. And so he runs away, converts to Judaism, and ends up being the ancestor of Rabbi Meir. Very, very different to what we know from Roman history, that, Nero ends up being this cruel tyrant who allegedly burns down Rome. We have internal contradictions in Aggadah, different rabbinic stories describing the very same historical event very differently. So again, in the destruction of Jerusalem, in the Bavli, Marta bat Baitos dies in the course of the destruction. In the Yerushalmi, she doesn't die. She survives the destruction. She simply loses all her money. We have an emphasis in this story on moral causality rather than geopolitical causality, which, if the rabbis were historians, would have been a concern to them, and it is absolutely not. So again, in the destruction story cycle, it begins by saying Jerusalem was destroyed, and a historian would say Jerusalem was destroyed because the small Jewish polity tried to take on the mighty Roman Empire. But in the Talmud, Jerusalem is destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, because the rabbis have a lesson they want to be teaching us. We have supernatural occurrences, as I mentioned, which also alludes to the fictional nature of these stories. And perhaps most importantly, these stories have a literary elegance and a structural artistry, which really does imply that they are elaborate pieces of fiction. Now, 19th century historians were not stupid. They knew that this was fiction. However, they did believe, and not incorrectly, that these stories all contain a kernel of historical truth. And so they said, let me take a story, I'll sort of do away with all the literary rubbish, and I'll extract that historical kernel, and then I'll take these historical kernels and I'll piece them into a general history of the rabbinic period. And various histories were created in the 19th century using this methodology, a methodology that we now know to be deeply flawed because it imposes a very modern conception of history on pre-modern texts that did not share the same concept. And in order to kind of piece together these different historical kernels, the historians end up bringing in a whole new layer of fiction in place of the fiction they try to do away with. But that already changes in the 20th century. In the 20th century, Aggadah becomes the rightful province of those who I would say are best equipped to analyze it, and that is not historians, that is literary scholars. So literary scholars in the mid-20th century basically said Aggadah is literature. That is how it was created. and that is how it ought to be read. The rabbis use, again, the quote, words that draw one's heart like a narrative in order to impart certain moral or religious lessons. And this kind of blows up the field. It blows up the field first because there is a newfound appreciation of just the rabbinic storytelling genius. And rather than trying to do away with the literary rubbish of these stories, now the literary properties become the focus of analysis. It also makes the field far more rich and exciting because if these stories are in fact literature, well, then any literary stream, any literary theory that we use to understand Homer or Shakespeare or Charlotte Bronte, we can now apply to Aggadah. And so today you have structural readings of Aggadah and psychoanalytic readings of Aggadah. You have feminist readings of Aggadah and Marxist readings of Aggadah and post-colonial readings of Aggadah. But perhaps the most interesting thing with the turn to Aggadah as literature is that if you assume these stories are in fact literary fictions, it makes them not less historically important, it makes them more historically important.
In what way?
Again, if we go back to the story of Rav and Shmuel, which I mentioned earlier, if the story of Rav and Shmuel actually happened the way the rabbis say that it did, it is a record of one thing that happened one time to two people. But if it is a rabbinic creation, if it is a piece of fiction that was put together, transmitted and edited by generations and generations of rabbis, well, then it provides us with a window into the mindsets of generations of rabbinic authors, editors, and transmitters. So turns out that Aggadah actually is a window into the rabbinic period, but not in the way that 19th century historians thought. It is a record not of the story's characters, but of the story's creators. And so Aggadah today has become extremely popular, extremely rich. These are some of the most beloved texts to be studied in schools, in synagogues, in secular universities, in traditional yeshivas, in Jewish institutions, and I would say beyond the Jewish world. There really is a great interest in these stories. And I think it's precisely because of what you alluded to earlier, precisely because these stories do certain things that halakha does not. So for the one thing, as I mentioned, these stories are literary masterpieces. The rabbis were storytelling geniuses, and because these stories underwent generations of editing and transmission, by the time they actually receive their final form in the Talmud, they are intricately structured and elaborately thought out, which makes their analysis really challenging and really, really fun. They read like simple folk tales, but if you know how to scratch the surface, you'll find these worlds of drama and conflict and passion and emotion that burst forth from between the lines.
I love that. And in fact, what you just said, Gila, a moment ago, echoes something that I've argued for many years, which is that if people ask, is that midrash historical? Did it really happen? On some level, I often say about a piece of Aggadah or a midrash, if all that Chazal were telling us is that this is what happened, then your job is done. It actually means that you've treated it very simply. Like, what is it teaching me? It's teaching me history. Well, once I know the history, I'm done. If, on the other hand, you say it's not meant as literal history, whether or not it happened, it's there for a different purpose, then your work has just begun. And the real analysis has to begin now. Because if you're not taking it literally, or you don't really care if it's meant literally true, in that case, the real work has to start, the real limud haTorah then begins at that point.
So I don't know if people who are actually watching rather than just listening could see my background. On my bookshelf, there is a frame, and this was a gift of a student of mine who basically very sweetly gave each one of her teachers a framed statement of the one thing that we said during that year that made the most impression on her. And the thing that my frame says is, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't true.
Beautiful. I love
and
that.
I say that a lot about rabbinic stories. Just because these stories didn't happen doesn't mean they're not true. We have this very modern notion that the only truth out there is historical truth. And that is a very limiting view of truth. There are moral truths, there are religious truths, there are psychological truths, and these are the truths of rabbinic stories.
I want to push back on something that you said a few moments ago, Gila, when you said that we should treat these stories as fiction. If we say that the ancients, in the time of Chazal, didn't have a concept of history, and therefore treating it as straight history doesn't really make a lot of sense, doesn't that also work on the flip side? They didn't necessarily have a concept of it's not historical because they weren't thinking in those categories. So is it really fair to say that it's fictional as opposed to historical, or is it better to say it's in neither of those categories? It's its own unique characterization.
So I don't think the ancients did not have a concept of history. I just think it was a very different concept to the one we have today. It was not positivist. And again, I think the rabbis were not attempting to convey history. I don't know, is the honest answer. I don't know whether they were incapable of it or whether they would have been absolutely capable of it. It was just of no interest to them. My guess would be that it was of no interest to them because at the time the rabbis lived, they were actual historians. The Romans had a strong discipline of history, and it would not have been foreign to the rabbis. It was simply not what the rabbis did.
Although the historians of the Roman times wouldn't be considered historians in the sense that we have them in the 21st century.
Correct. We know today that even those, actual historians, those people who did history as their day job, kind of mixed fact and fiction far more freely than modern historians would ever allow themselves to do.
Okay, I want to ask you about that idea of Aggadah adding something that the halacha cannot provide, both in the time of Chazal and nowadays. And in particular, you talk about how Aggadah can be subversive. Can you explain what that means?
Yes. So I think, as I say, there are various reasons why Aggadah today is so popular and so universally studied within, the Jewish world. I would say, for one thing, these stories are very accessible. So halacha, and if you've ever studied Talmud, you know this, the halachic discussions, they're long, they're complex, they're very laden with jargon. It does take a lot of specialized study to be able to really master the halachic sections of the Talmud. Whereas Aggadah, these stories are short, they're seemingly simple, and they can be read and understood, at least on some level, by anyone. I say at least on some level because, as I mentioned earlier, there really is a gap between what these stories seem to be saying and what they are actually saying, and you do need some study to be able to get past the false front of these stories. But they are far more accessible. They're also far more existentially relevant. So halakha will very often include these arcane and obsolete laws that have very little bearing on our lives today in the 21st century, whereas Aggadah deals with themes that are remarkably close to home. We have stories of people who are dealing with difficult parents or disobedient children, with treacherous friends and insensitive spouses, with financial insecurity and failing health, existential dilemmas, ethical problems, loneliness, death, really things that can happen to you and me. And so these stories, although they are a millennium and a half old, they're really existentially relevant. They really speak to us in a way which reads as very, very contemporary. But to go to that final bit of your question, yes, Aggadah is extremely subversive, and there's something about that I think really speaks to the spirit of the age. One of the many remarkable things about the rabbis is that the rabbis, on the one hand, were great halachists, and on the other hand, they fully recognized that halakha is not always enough. So the halachic system is a general system designed for the general good, like any code of law. And like any code of law, it will necessarily infringe on those that don't fit the mainstream. The rabbis acknowledge this, they recognize this, and so alongside halakha, they give us Aggadah. They give us stories that critique their legal system, that recognize its limitations, and that give voice to those that it inadvertently hurts. And there is something about this rabbinic self-critique, I think, that is extremely appealing to us today in the 21st century. Aggadah as the laughing face of God, that subversiveness that made Aggadah so problematic for so long is precisely what makes it so popular today. And I would say that we are probably the first Jews since the rabbinic period that are able to read Aggadah with the same sort of radical or subversive spirit with which it was originally created, which makes it a very exciting time to be an Aggadist.
Why are we the first to be able to do that?
Because for most of Jewish history, that radical spirit was missing from the Jewish ethos. The rabbis were extremely radical. And then, as generally happens when a fringe movement becomes mainstream, they lose that radical edge. As we exit the rabbinic period, those subversive elements that we find very strongly in rabbinic literature, they disappear. And they remain absent from the Jewish tradition more or less until today, until the 21st century, where postmodernism, for better or worse, I think very often for worse, I'm not a big fan of postmodernism, but it has allowed us to reconnect to a certain radical property of rabbinic storytelling that I think has gone underappreciated for most of Jewish history.
So can you give an example of a subversive Aggadah, something that critiques the halachic system, as you put it?
So it's not at all uncommon to have a halachic discussion in the Talmud, which sort of puts forward a normative position, which is then followed by an Aggadah that completely turns that position on its head, that questions or critiques or even completely contradicts it. And a classic example of this is the story of Choma, which I discuss in the second chapter of my book. So in Tractate Yevamot, we have a law that prohibits marriage to an Isha Katlanit. An Isha Katlanit is a woman who has lost 2 or 3 husbands and who is suspected of somehow being the cause of their death. And you're not allowed to endanger your own life, so you're not allowed to marry her. And then in Tractate Ketubot, you have another halachic discussion which discusses the need to limit the wine intake of an unattached woman, a woman who has no male guardian who is there to curb and control her sexual desire. And then directly after that discussion in Tractate Ketubot, we have the story of Choma. Choma is both an unattached woman, because her husband Abaye has just died, and she's a fatal woman. She's an Isha Katlanit because Abaye was her 3rd husband. And yet this unattached woman, whose sexuality we expect to run wild at any moment, is completely dignified in the course of the story, where all the other characters lose control. And this dangerous Isha Katlanit, who is suspected as being the cause of her husband's death, is revealed to be a wretched 3-time widow who's lost every man she ever loved. And by the end of the story, she is cruelly kicked out of her town. In telling us this story, the story of Choma, the rabbis demonstrate that they are aware of the shortcomings of their halachic positions, the unfairness toward unattached women, the untenable position in which it places 3-time widows. Interestingly, they don't change the halakha. The halakha stands, because the halakha is still primarily concerned with protecting the social order, which, yes, may be endangered by an intoxicated, unattached woman. And it is concerned with individual safety, which is threatened by an Isha Katlanit and whatever sexually transmitted disease she may or may not be carrying. So halakha stands. But at the same time, the rabbis fully take pity on those women who are hurt by halakha. They counter it with Aggadah. And in countering it with Aggadah, they exhort us readers to do the same, to also take pity and be especially compassionate toward those who don't fit the mainstream.
That's a fascinating example. On the other hand, we also have a concept called ma'aseh listor, which is that if there is a halachic Gemara that is followed by a story that contradicts it, we say that can't be. There's something missing in our understanding because we should not have a story which contradicts the normative halacha. How does that work with that subversive element that you're talking about?
So I would say, again, that as part of, we've discussed a number of categorical errors in reading Aggadah. I think another error is to try and harmonize it with halakha, to really try and show that there is one view that is revealed in an entire sugya. I don't think that is correct. I think the bread and butter of rabbinic literature is its multivocality. There are different voices, there are different positions, and very often these different positions are revealed in the different genres of halakha and Aggadah. I think that is far more interesting than trying to find one consistent voice, is actually bringing out the tensions between this voice and that voice, between a rabbi who believes one thing, a rabbi who believes another thing, between halakha, which represents the mainstream, and Aggadah, which gives voice to the marginalized minority.
As you're speaking right now, I'm thinking of the very well-known piece of Aggadah in the 4th parak of Masechet Brachot, when Rabbi Gamliel is temporarily kicked out of being the head of the Sanhedrin, which seems to show this tension between the established leadership and what comes across as an almost democratic voice of the people uprising. And what's fascinating to me is that it doesn't come to an easy conclusion about who was right. It's not as though Rabbi Gamliel mistreated Rabbi Yoshua, and therefore Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah becomes the new Nasi. That's not the whole story. In the end, as I read this piece of Aggadah, Rabbi Yoshua implies that Rabbi Gamliel was kind of right. And he says this even though he was the victim of Rabbi Gamliel's lack of generosity or lack of gentleness towards him. The way he puts it is that we don't really understand, because we're not leaders, what it's like to have the burden of leadership on your shoulders. He uses a metaphor. He says, somebody who himself has sprinkled the ashes of the para aduma, of the red heifer, who is the son of somebody who did the same thing. He can't be told by somebody who's never done that before that your ashes are no good or your water of sprinkling is no good. Only somebody who's actually been in that position can really understand the burdens of leadership and what's required. And because of that, the story ends on a somewhat ambiguous note. Even though it seems all along that Rabbi Gamliel is being criticized, at the end, there's a twist, and he suddenly appears perhaps as the good guy, the one who was right all along.
I think that's exactly right. And that's precisely why I say I think it's a categorical error to try and harmonize the views of Halacha and Aggadah, because we often can't even harmonize the views coming up from one Aggadah. Even within the course of one story, we will have what the Greeks call aporia, and what Shalom Aleichem beautifully describes in Fiddler on the Roof as he is right, they can't both be right, you know what, you're also right. That to me is such a beautiful description of many of the stories of the Talmud, because you do have these contradicting truths, and the rabbis were experts in being able to hold these two contradicting truths, being able to sort of sit in the tension between them and say, this is right and this is right. And you know what, you were also right.
One thing, Gila, that you mentioned as well in your book, The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic, is that Aggadah gives a voice to the other. The other can mean anybody. It could mean women. It can mean non-Jews. It could be other people who are marginalized. Can you give an example of where we can see that?
I mentioned Nero, who again is it's always quite humorous because he's such a infamous character in world history, but the rabbis for some reason really kind of like him, and he comes out as this positive character. And what is remarkable is that in this long story cycle describing the disastrous events that lead ultimately to the destruction of the temple and the fall of Judea, you have one moment after the next where the disaster could have been completely averted if the rabbis at the time would have taken a stand and made a difficult decision. And the rabbis again and again and again fail. They do nothing. They're so afraid of getting it wrong. They're so afraid of making a mistake. They end up doing nothing, which ends up being the greatest mistake of all. And after a lengthy account of one failing after the next, you get to Nero, a Roman, a non-Jew, who finds himself in a position very much like the rabbis where there are no good options. And he very courageously says, okay, between these two not great options, I'm going to take one. And the result of this non-Jew courageously making a choice, as the Talmud has it, is Rabbi Meir. Nero goes off, converts, and becomes the ancestor of Rabbi Meir, who, is a man of immeasurable contribution to Jewish life and learning. This, in contrast to the rabbis throughout the story, who basically, through their own inability to act, end up bringing an end to Jewish life as we know it. And so the rabbis don't shy away of telling us stories where non-Jews outperform Jews, and simple learned folk put rabbis to shame, and women outdo men. And we see this again and again in rabbinic storytelling, the rabbis using the other in order to critique the self.
Gila, let me ask you something. I don't know the answer to this. I'm not a literary scholar at all, but how do you make sure that you're not, or anyone who's reading Aggadah in these ways is not, imposing our 21st century sensibilities upon the thought of the rabbis? It's very 21st century to say that women have been marginalized and this non-Jew actually knows better than the rabbis. But is that really what they're saying, or are we only assuming that because we're coming with our preconceived notions?
So again, going back to what I said earlier about reading as relationship and being very, very careful, as you would in a relationship, to not be imposing yourself entirely and steamrolling over the other person. I say that I came to the text very frankly with my own feminist sensibilities. And that did determine which stories I chose to read in the book. But I never allowed them to dictate how I would read these stories. In other words, I think your own sensibilities are great as a point of departure, but they must never dictate where you end up. How do you make sure that they don't dictate where you end up? One thing is self-awareness. You have to be aware of your own biases, and you have to be very careful to not be reading them into the text. But the other thing, and again, part of the reason that I wrote this book, is that I couldn't find any good popular guide anywhere to how to read Aggadah, how to read the stories, or at least the rabbinic legends of the Talmud. And what I do very early on in the book is I give a program, just a list of reading rules. This is what you have to do. You have to zoom in and do a close reading, and I show exactly how to do a close reading. And then you have to zoom out and do a contextual reading, and I show the different layers of context you have to take into account, and I give 3 reading hypotheses. And my contention is, if you take these reading rules all together and you apply them as rigorously as you can, that is as good a protection as any against you reading yourself into the text. That basically will force you to listen to the text rather than speak out the text. It will force you to hear what the text wants to tell you rather than you telling the text what you want for it to be saying.
So let's move a little bit away from the concept of a literary reading of Aggadah and into the idea of the spiritual benefit that Jews today can get from it. What I mean by that is that I think it's a real issue in many communities that we don't have enough, for lack of a better term, spirituality. Too often we fall into a binary way of thinking about halacha, or perhaps better, a univocal way of thinking about Jewish thought and Jewish law, which says that everything is exactly the same. The entire goal is to unify it into a single voice and to allow other voices to go by the side and wither there. I think this is actually dangerous to developing a sense of spirituality. Personally, having many different opinions fighting with each other is, for me, an aspect of lahagdil Torah or lahadira, to make Torah great and glorious. We are stronger when we don't try to narrow Torah into a small box when it could be in a much larger container. How can we use the literary devices and methodologies that you're talking about today to build a sense of not just literary appreciation for the mixed messages that are in Chazal, but actual spiritual growth? The idea that there is godliness here, that I can learn about God, I can understand the theology behind it, I can understand some ideas that might enrich my spiritual life, my religious life. Particularly, Gila, if we're not going to use the Maharal's method of trying to turn it into a parable, which might be the most obvious way of doing so.
So again, going back to that original definition that I mentioned, you want to know God, read Aggadah. The rabbis say very clearly, Aggadah is the way to know God. And if you are going to define spirituality, which I personally do, as a relationship with God, as having a very honest, very present, very serious relationship with God in your life, I see no better way to do that than the reading of Aggadah. One of my favorite definitions of Aggadah is Arielon, Fine Aggadah, says there are 2 types of rabbinic stories. Those that tell us that the gap between man and God is smaller than we think, and those that tell us that the gap between man and man is larger than we suspect. By that definition, many stories in the Talmud tell us about how the gap between you and God is actually not as great as you think. And in that respect, I think that the God of the Talmud and the God of rabbinic stories is a far better God to have a relationship with than the God of the Bible. I think part of what you describe as the lack of spirituality in our lives, beyond the marginalization of Aggadah, has to do with the fact that when we think about God, we think about God of the Bible. One of the new atheists describes the God of the Bible as one of the most unpleasant characters in all of Western fiction. And they have a point. In other words, the God of the Bible is very often angry and tyrannical and vengeful and jealous. And it's very hard to have a healthy, a constructive, an open and honest relationship with that kind of character. And I think that is, for better or worse, the God that many of us have in mind when we pray. That is not the God of the Talmud. The God of the Talmud, the God after the destruction of the temple, is far more vulnerable, far more lonely, far more fragile, and very much in need of the companionship of man. And I like to say that God of the Bible is kind of the way you would see a parent when you're an infant. They're all powerful, and they're often quite terrifying. The God of the Talmud is how you would see that same parent once you've grown up. Because we have grown up at this point. We are more mature people. And the parent has grown old and frail. And you as the adult child realize that you are now at least 50% responsible for that relationship. And that your parent might need you every bit as much as you need the parent. And I think praying to that God, a God who's actually vulnerable to you, who is susceptible to your hurt and is desperate for your love and companionship, that is a far more meaningful type of prayer. And that is a far more spiritual life, to live your life in the presence of a God who needs you almost as much as you need him.
That is a beautiful idea, very much reminiscent of Heschel. Gila, as we conclude, I'd like to ask you, just to give a type of summary, what do you want the future to bring if you could control the educational institutions in our world? What would you like them to do with Aggadah? What would be its place? Would it be as important as halacha in our studies? Would it be a marginalized subject but is still on the table? Would it be the most important thing that we study? What do you see as the future for this? What would you want to happen?
I'm quite optimistic when it comes to Aggadah. I think we are very much going in the right direction. I think Aggadah is today becoming increasingly popular. It's really assuming a rightful place within Jewish studies. I would like for it to be as viable an option. You know, the idea is, En adam lomed Torah ela b'makom shelibo chafetz. You ought to be learning the Torah that your heart desires. And some people are going to gravitate toward halacha, and they should be halachis. And other people, myself very much included, will gravitate toward Aggadah, and they should be Aggadis. And these options should be out there for all to choose. Yes, I would like to see Aggadah assume a more central place within the school system. I would love it if it made its way into the Haredi school system. I think that could, going back to your previous podcast, which I listened to and very much enjoyed, I think that could be an answer to many things.
Gila, I really appreciate talking to you today. I've learned a lot, and I think that you are doing a tremendous service, again, Lagdil Torah lahadira, to make Torah great and glorious, in this re-emphasis on Aggadah and helping us to maybe reframe what it can bring to the table and why it's important. So, Gila Fine, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.